Montana Territory. Fall 1885. Nobody in Willow Creek Valley ever asked Agnes Harlow why she spent her mornings beneath the barn floor. They assumed she had gone strange after losing Elias. They assumed grief had done something to her judgment, the way a hard frost splits a fence post. Quietly, invisibly, until one morning it simply falls. They were wrong, but we'll get to that. First, you need to understand the cold. Not the cold, from stepping outside on a January morning in a city with insulated walls and a furnace running somewhere beneath your feet. Not that kind. This was Montana cold, the kind that didn't push against you. It pressed into you. It found the seam between your collar and your neck, the gap where your boot lacing wasn't quite tight enough, the thin place in the cabin wall where the chinking had dried and crumbled through the summer. It found every weakness you had, every decision you'd put off, every repair you'd told yourself could wait until spring. Spring in Montana felt like a lie you told yourself to get through February. Agnes Harlow had lived in Willow Creek Valley for 11 years. She knew the cold the way you know a difficult neighbor, not with affection, not with fear, exactly, but with the steady, clear-eyed wariness of someone who has learned not to underestimate what lives next door. She was 34 years old, medium height, with the kind of posture that came not from pride, but from years of carrying things. Her hair was dark brown, threaded with early gray at the temples. Her hands were the hands of someone who had never once, in 11 years, let a day pass without using them. Calloused at the palm, strong at the wrist, capable of almost anything she needed them to do. She had 2 children. Owen was 8. Quiet for his age, with a habit of watching situations longer than most boys his age could stand to. He had his father's square jaw and his mother's eyes, dark, patient, measuring. June was 5, small and quick, the kind of child who asked 3 questions before you'd finished answering the first one. She had decided at age 4 that she was afraid of nothing, and at age 5 she was still testing that theory against every new thing the world offered. Her husband Elias had been dead for nearly 2 years. Lung fever, that's what the doctor in the nearest town had called it, though the nearest town was a half-day's ride, and the doctor had arrived too late to do anything but confirm what Agnes already knew by then. Elias had worked in the cold and slept in the damp and breathed the night air of a cabin where the fire never quite kept pace with the temperature outside. It wasn't unusual. Half the men who homesteaded in that valley in those years died of something connected to winter. Cold didn't kill you loudly. It just made everything else more possible. What mattered was this. Agnes was alone now, alone with 800 acres she couldn't fully work, a homestead claim she was determined not to lose, 2 children who needed to survive another winter, and a woodpile that, if the season came in hard, would not be enough. She had done the arithmetic many times. It always came out the same. The cabin sat low on the property, sheltered on 3 sides by a long ridge and 2 stands of lodgepole pine. Elias had chosen the site well in that regard, but the cabin itself was ordinary. Squared logs, mud and straw chinking, a single stone fireplace that took half the night to heat the room and lost half that heat before morning. The floorboards were laid straight onto compacted earth. On the coldest nights, frost pushed up between the seams and spread across the planks in pale crystalline patterns that would have been beautiful if Agnes had had any energy left to find things beautiful by the time they appeared. She woke before light every morning. She built the fire back from coals. She broke ice from the water basin. She pulled on 2 pairs of socks and 3 layers and went outside to feed the animals before the children woke. The previous winter had been the worst. Not the worst in the valley's recorded history. That distinction belonged to a blizzard in 1880 that people still reference the way you reference a war, as a dividing line between what came before and what came after. But bad enough, a long cold that had settled in before Christmas and refused to release its grip until late March. The kind of cold that didn't come in waves. It just stayed. By January, Owen had started coughing. By February, the cough had moved deep into his chest, and Agnes had burned through 2/3 of her stored wood, trying to keep the cabin above 40 degrees at night. She slept sitting up in the chair beside the hearth, waking every 40 minutes to add wood, watching her son breathe in the amber light of the fire and listening for the wet, dragging sound that meant things were getting worse. Things had gotten worse. For 6 days in late February, she thought she was going to lose him. She did not let herself think it in those words. She thought instead about the fire, about the wood, about the temperature in the room, about water and broth and keeping his chest elevated, and what she could do with her hands at 3 in the morning that might help. She thought in actions. She always had. It was one of the things Elias had admired about her and one of the things her neighbors had never quite understood about her. Owen had survived. Spring came. The valley exhaled. Agnes stacked the remaining wood and looked at how little there was and stood there for a long time without moving. She thought, I cannot do this the same way again. She didn't know yet what the other way looked like. She didn't have a plan. She had a problem and a mind that refused to stop working on it. And that, as it turned out, was enough to begin with. She started watching the barn. The barn sat 30 yards north of the cabin, smaller, lower, older, and less carefully built than anything Elias had put serious time into. It was the kind of structure that had been added to and patched over years until it resembled nothing so much as a set of decisions made in different seasons by people with different intentions. The north wall was the exception. Elias had piled earth against the barn's north wall the spring before he died. Not from any particular plan, not from any engineering knowledge, but because he dug out a stretch of soft ground near the barn's foundation to check for rot and had needed somewhere to put the soil. He'd pushed it up against the wall with a shovel, packed it roughly flat, and moved on to the next task. He'd never mentioned it, probably never thought about it again. Agnes had noticed it last February. She had been up before 4 in the morning. Owen's fever had spiked in the night, and she'd gone to the barn to check on the animals. Moving fast in the dark with a lamp, her mind focused entirely on getting through the next 2 hours. Inside the barn, she's down, bushy man. She'd stopped. It was warm. Not warm like a heated room. Warm like the difference between standing outside and standing in a doorway. The 2 draft horses shifted in their stalls. The Jersey cow exhaled a long, slow breath that fogged in the lamplight. The hay in the loft above pressed down like insulation. In the north wall, the one with Elias's careless pile of earth banked against it, seemed to hold something. A steadiness. A temperature that didn't drop the way the cabins did. Agnes had stood there with Owen pressed against her shoulder and thought, this is warmer than inside my house. She hadn't acted on it then. She'd filed it away the way you file things when you're in survival mode. Carefully, quietly, in a place you know you'll find it again. She went back to Owen. She got him through the night. She got them through the winter. But she didn't forget. That summer, while the valley warmed and the grass came back and people stopped thinking about cold for a few months, Agnes thought about it constantly. She thought about the earth itself, the temperature of it, not at the surface where the sun hit, but lower down where it leveled out and stayed. She thought about how the root cellar behind the cabin stayed cool all summer and above freezing all winter without any fire at all. She thought about groundhogs and the dens they dug and the fact that they came out of them in spring, having survived everything that had killed less careful creatures. She thought about what was possible if you stopped fighting the cold and started working with what the earth already knew. By September, she had a plan. She told no one. This was not stubbornness. It wasn't secrecy for its own sake. It was something more practical than that. Agnes understood, without needing to think it through at length, that the people of Willow Creek Valley were good people who would listen to what she was describing and think she had lost her mind. They would mean well. They would express concern. They would perhaps suggest she come stay with someone in town until spring, which would mean losing the homestead claim, which she was not going to let happen. And so she said nothing. And on the 2nd day of October, 1885, after she had fed the animals and sent Owen to his schoolwork and settled June with a pile of cut cloth to sort, she went to the barn, lifted a plank near the back wall, and began to dig. The ground was hard. Not frozen yet, but close. The cold had been working its way down through the soil for weeks, and at 6 inches the earth changed character, became dense and stubborn, and full of small stones that had to be worked out one by one. Agnes had 2 shovels, a pickaxe she'd sharpened the week before without telling herself why, and a set of wooden buckets that she filled and carried out through the barn's side door to a long drainage ditch 60 yards from the building. She spread the soil thin, raked it smooth, covered it with dead grass pulled from the fence lines. By the end of the first week, she had a hole 4 feet deep and 5 feet across. By the end of the second week, she had broken 2 shovels and developed a blister on her right palm that had opened and scarred over and opened again. The hole was 6 feet deep and 8 feet across. She had learned to brace the walls with flat stones as she went, sandstone from the creek bed, pieces she could carry alone, fitting them against each other in rough courses with the patience of someone who had no one to hurry for. By the end of the third week, she was done with the digging. The chamber measured 8 feet wide, 11 feet long, and 7 feet deep from the floor to the underside of the barn's joists above. She had not planned those dimensions with particular precision. She had planned them with a mother's precision, which is different. Enough room for 3 people to light down, enough height to stand without bowing, small enough that whatever heat accumulated inside would have nowhere to go. She had thought carefully about weight. The barn floor above her would carry horses, hay, winter snow, possibly all three at once. Elias had left behind a collection of salvaged timber from a fencing shed he'd planned to demolish, and Agnes spent 4 days selecting beams, cutting them to length with a two-man saw she operated alone, and fitting them as ceiling supports across the chamber. She wedged each beam into place with care, testing the flex, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. It wasn't engineering, it was attention. It was the same quality of attention she'd brought to every difficult thing in her life. And it was, she had come to believe, worth more than training that came without it. The floor she left as dirt, but she shaped it. She sloped it gently and maybe half an inch to the foot, toward the southeast corner of the chamber, where she dug a small basin and filled it with creek gravel. If water came in, it would travel to that corner. It would have somewhere to go. The entrance gave her the most trouble. She needed to get in and out without anyone seeing, without leaving a visible opening in the barn floor, and without creating a gap that would let cold air pour straight down into the space below. She solved it the way she solved most things, by thinking about it from every angle for several days until the answer became clear. She framed a trap door from the same salvaged lumber, cutting the planks to fit flush with the barn floor and hanging them on leather hinges she oiled weekly. Closed, you wouldn't notice it unless you knew to look. A short ladder, or 8 rungs, solid, tested with her full weight plus an armload of firewood, dropped down to the chamber floor. Ventilation nearly stopped the whole project. She understood, in a practical way that required no formal education, that a sealed underground room would kill you. Not quickly, slowly, the way that things underground tended to work, with patience and without drama. Carbon dioxide would build, moisture would follow, the space would become first uncomfortable, then dangerous, then fatal. She needed air to move. She found the solution in a pile of old clay drainage tiles stacked against the barn's east wall, 8 inches across, cracked at the ends but largely intact, the kind of thing Elias had acquired at some point with an intention he had never followed through on. Agnes ran 2 of them from the chamber ceiling up through the barn wall, angling slightly upward so that warm air could rise and exit. She disguised the exterior openings as part of the foundation base, packing rough stone around them until they looked like nothing at all. For heat, she built a small firebox in the chamber's northwest corner. Not a fireplace, nothing so grand, just a contained space for a modest fire, lined with flat stone and fed by a flue. She ran upward to join the ventilation path before exiting the barn wall. She tested it 3 times with small fires before she was satisfied that the smoke went where she intended and nothing else caught. The real warmth, she knew, would not come from fire. It would come from the earth on every side, 18 inches of it, holding steady at whatever temperature the deep ground reached and held through every season. It would come from the horses and the cow above her, living slow furnaces that breathed and sweated and radiated heat downward through the floor without ever knowing they were doing it. It would come from the hay above the animals, packed and settled into a dense insulating layer between the livestock and the skin, and it would come from the chamber's own proportions, its size calibrated so that 3 human bodies could hold the air in it against whatever the Montana night chose to do. She furnished it with what she had: a rope bed she rebuilt smaller, filled with fresh straw, covered with the heaviest blankets she owned, 2 low pallets for the children, fitted against the eastern wall, a small table, an oil lamp with a good reservoir and a trimmed wick, a trunk with a flat lid that served as both storage and seating, a tin box for the fire tools. It was not comfortable. It was not meant to be comfortable in the way that word implies ease or softness. It was meant to be survivable. There is a difference, and Agnes Harlow understood it as well as anyone who has ever had to. She finished on a Thursday in mid-November. She climbed down the ladder for the last time with both children's bedding bundled under one arm and an oil lamp in her other hand, and she set the lamp on the low table and looked at what she had made. Stone walls, close and solid, faintly damp to the touch in the way that earth-held stone always is, not with water, but with the memory of water. Timber ceiling overhead, the barn's old joists running perpendicular above the beams, she'd added, everything interlocked and braced. The smell of turned earth and dry hay and the faint, warm animal smell that filtered down from above. The sound of hooves, slow, heavy, settling, moving somewhere overhead in that patient, half-asleep way horses have at night. She stood there for a moment, just a moment. Then she went to get the children. Owen came down the ladder first. He moved carefully, one rung at a time, his eyes adjusting to the lamplight. He stood at the bottom and turned slowly, taking in the walls, the ceiling, the corners. He said nothing for a long time. This was very much Owen. June came down less carefully, because June did most things less carefully, and she stood at the bottom of the ladder and said, "Is this a fort?" Agnes looked at her daughter. "For the winter," she said, "just for winter." June reached out and pressed both palms flat against the stone wall nearest her, feeling the temperature of it. "It's warm," she said, with the particular tone of a 5-year-old encountering something that contradicts what she expected, something that makes the world slightly more interesting than it was a moment ago. "Yes," Agnes said. Owen looked up at the ceiling, at the joists and beams. He listened. Above them, one of the draft horses shifted its weight, a slow, creaking sound, hooves against packed earth, and then the deep, rhythmic sound of the animal breathing, close and patient. "Will the cows hear us?" June asked. "Yes," Agnes said. "Will they mind?" Agnes looked up at the ceiling, at the boards and beams between her and the animals that would spend the winter keeping the space alive without ever knowing they were doing it. "No," she said. "They don't even know they're keeping us alive." She turned down the lamp. The three of them lay in the near dark, listening to the sounds above them and outside the barn, though they could barely hear it now, muffled by earth and timber and distance. The first snow of the winter was beginning to fall. It fell without announcement. It fell the way most important things fall in Montana, quietly, steadily, without asking permission, without caring whether anyone was ready. Agnes Harlow listened to it not fall. Listened to the silence that the earth made around them, the steady held breath of stone and soil that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. She was not warm in the way that people are warm when they are careless about it. She was warm in the way that people are warm when they have worked very hard to earn it. And 30 yards away in the dark cabin, the fire burned low and untended, and the smoke that rose from its chimney, thin now, barely there, told anyone watching that Agnes Harlow was home. She was home, just not where anyone thought to look. Dorothea Vane saw the blankets. She didn't see them up close. She saw them from the road, a bundle of dark wool being carried across the yard toward the barn at dusk, by a woman moving with the particular purposeful speed of someone who didn't want to be watched. Dorothea mentioned it to her husband Herschel that evening over supper, the way you mention things that don't quite fit. Herschel said, "She's been strange since Elias." This was Herschel's explanation for most things Agnes did that he didn't understand. Dorothea said, "I don't think she's bought wood." This gave Herschel pause. In Willow Creek Valley in 1885, not buying wood before winter was not a quirk. It was either a sign of profound miscalculation or profound confidence, and he could not figure out which applied to Agnes Harlow. At the trading post, Cormac Dell had noticed the same thing from a different angle. Agnes had come in twice in October, once for lamp oil, once for lamp oil again, in quantities that suggested she planned to burn a great deal of it through the dark months. She had not bought a single cord of wood. She had not asked about the coal that Dell had freighted in from the north in September. She had looked, as she always looked, like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and did not particularly require his opinion of it. Dell turned this over in his mind for a few days and then set it aside. He had a trading post to run and a winter to prepare for, and Agnes Harlow was, as far as he could determine, a grown woman of sound judgment who had survived 2 years on her own with 2 children and had not yet asked for anything she couldn't pay for. The valley talked, not cruelly, not yet, but with that particular small community unease that attaches itself to anything it doesn't recognize. She's spending a lot of time in the barn. She's not laying in wood. She's been carrying things out there after dark. And the word that found Agnes at church on the first Sunday of December, traveling not in a direct sentence, but in the slight pause before a greeting, in the look held a half-second too long, in the careful way two women stopped talking when she came within earshot. The word was odd. Agnes Harlow had gone odd, but that was the verdict. Winter hadn't even arrived yet. Agnes heard it and noted it the way she noted most things, as information, as data, as a condition she could not change, and therefore did not spend energy on. She drove her wagon back from church along the rutted road through the bare cottonwoods with Owen beside her and June asleep in the back, and she thought about the ventilation in the chamber and whether she needed to angle the second tile slightly higher to improve the draw, and she did not think about what Dorothea Vane thought of her. There were things you could control and things you couldn't. Agnes Harlow had made peace with that distinction a long time ago. December came in cold and stayed cold. Not violent, not yet. Just a steady, pressing cold that settled into the valley like a decision that had already been made. The creek skinned over with ice. The ruts in the road froze solid. Frost appeared on the windows every morning in elaborate crystalline patterns that June traced with one small finger, while Owen ate breakfast and Agnes moved through the morning tasks with the focused efficiency of someone who has reduced everything to what matters. Each evening, after the animals were fed and the cabin's daytime fire banked low, Agnes gathered the children and they walked to the barn together in the early dark. Owen carried the oil lamp. June carried her own blanket, folded over her arm with great seriousness, as if the responsibility of it was something she intended to honor. Agnes opened the barn door and they stepped into the warmth of animals and hay, and she lifted the trap door and they climbed down into the earth. Every night the temperature held. Every night the stone walls gave back the day's small warmth. Every night the horses shifted above them and breathed and did not know. And somewhere in Willow Creek Valley, in a cabin half a mile away, Herschel Vane was splitting his remaining wood in the dark and wondering why he always seemed to run short, and his wife Dorothea was tending a fire that demanded more than it gave. And nobody could explain why Agnes Harlow looked, every time they saw her, like a woman who was sleeping well. The first hard snow came on December 12th, 6 inches overnight. The valley went quiet in the particular way it goes quiet under new snow. Sounds flattened, distances shortened, the world made smaller and more immediate. Agnes walked to the barn that morning through drifts that came to her knees, broke ice from the water troughs, checked on the animals, and climbed down into the chamber to warm her hands. She noticed for the first time a faint sheen of moisture along one section of stone near the ceiling. She wiped it dry. She adjusted the ventilation tile, opening the draw slightly. She packed dry sand along the base of the wall where stone met soil. By evening, the moisture was gone. She lay awake that night, listening to the sounds above. The horses, the wind across the barn roof, the occasional creak of timber adjusting to the cold. And she ran through the chamber in her mind, the way a careful person runs through a plan, looking for the things she'd missed. She didn't find anything. What she found instead, sometime past midnight, was the particular peace that comes not from certainty but from having done everything you could think to do. She had watched, she had measured, she had built for what she knew and prepared for what she didn't. She had thought it through from every angle until the thinking was done. The rest was Winter's decision, not hers. She closed her eyes. Above her, the horses breathed on. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and indifferent, covering the yard, the ruts, the woodpile by the cabin door, covering the barn, and beneath the barn, beneath the floor and the animals and the stored warmth of late summer still locked in 18 inches of Montana earth, 3 people slept and did not feel the cold and waited for whatever came next. January 1886. The cold that settled into Willow Creek Valley in the first week of the new year was not dramatic about it. It didn't arrive with wind or spectacle. It arrived the way a serious man enters a room, quietly without announcement, in a way that made everything else go still. The thermometer outside Cormac Dell's trading post read -18 on the morning of January 8th. Dell stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at it, and went back inside without saying anything to anyone. There was nothing useful to say. The number was the number. Winter had stopped being polite. Agnes noted the temperature the same way she noted most things, as a fact to be worked with rather than an opinion to be held about. She had been watching the sky for 2 weeks. The light had changed in late December, going flat and gray and low, in a way that had nothing to do with clouds. It was the light of a sky that had made a decision. She had responded by doing what she always did when she couldn't control what was coming. She made sure everything she could control was exactly right. She checked the chamber every morning. She ran her hands along the stone walls, feeling for new moisture. She tested the ventilation draw by holding a small piece of thread near the vent opening and watching it move. She inspected the ceiling beams for any new flecks, any sound that hadn't been there before. She checked the firebox, the flue, the gravel drainage basin in the southeast corner. She restocked the oil lamp. She brought down an extra trunk of clothing, an additional blanket for each pallet, a tin of dried meat, a bag of cornmeal, a small pot. She was not afraid. Fear is for when you don't know what's coming. Agnes knew exactly what was coming. She had lived next to it her whole life. She was careful. There is a difference. The days between Christmas and the middle of January were the days of ordinary winter. The kind of cold that was difficult but manageable. The kind that required discipline and firewood and attention, but yielded to those things if you had enough of them. Families in the valley settled into their winter routines. Children stayed closer to home. Animals were fed early and checked twice. Stoves burned steady and hot, and the smell of wood smoke hung low over every property from before dawn until after dark. Agnes maintained the appearance of this life during the daylight hours. She kept a small fire in the cabin through the morning, enough to hold the temperature above freezing, enough to produce a thin ribbon of smoke from the chimney that told anyone watching what they expected to see. She cooked there, breakfast and the midday meal, and kept the children's schoolwork at the cabin table, and moved through the yard and the barn with the same rhythm she had always moved. She was Agnes Harlow, widow, homesteader, 4 miles from town. She was unremarkable. By 4 in the afternoon, when the light failed and the cold sharpened its edge, she banked the cabin fire and gathered the children, and they walked to the barn and descended. Owen had adapted immediately. He had his mother's quality of accepting a situation and working within it rather than against it. He brought his reader down, and his slate, and a piece of chalk, and in the lamplight he worked through his lessons with the focused quiet of a boy who had decided that underground schooling was simply how things were done now, and there was no reason to make anything of it. June had taken longer. June was 5 years old, and 5-year-olds are entitled to their doubts, and June exercised hers thoroughly. For the first week she had asked, each evening as they descended, a rotating series of questions that Agnes answered with the same patient directness she brought to everything. Will the horses walk on us? No. What if the dirt falls? It won't. What does the cow think about us? She doesn't think about us. What if we run out of air? We won't. How do you know? Because I made sure we wouldn't. This last answer, delivered not with reassurance but with the calm certainty of a woman describing a fact about the physical world, was the one that finally satisfied June. She understood instinctively, the way children sometimes do, that there is a difference between someone telling you not to worry and someone telling you they did the work. Agnes Harlow had done the work. June tucked this knowledge away and stopped asking about the air. She started drawing on the walls instead. By the first week of January, the east wall of the chamber held a gallery of June's chalk drawings, horses mostly, because the sounds above inspired them, and a house, and several figures of uncertain identity, and one elaborate scene that June described as the barn from underneath, which bore, Agnes had to admit, a certain abstract accuracy. This was the life they were living when the sky changed again. January 15th. Agnes woke in the chamber before dawn with a feeling she had learned to trust. Not a sound, not a sensation exactly. More like a pressure in the quality of the silence. She climbed the ladder quietly, not waking the children, and stepped into the barn. The horses were awake, both of them standing, ears forward, heads turned slightly toward the north wall. The cow was awake too, which was unusual. Animals know before instruments do. Agnes had believed this her entire life, and she believed it now. She pushed open the barn door and stepped outside. The air hit her like a closed fist. Not colder than it had been. Colder was coming, but it wasn't here yet. What hit her was the wind, a steady, unbroken push from the northwest that had not been there the night before. A wind that didn't gust or vary. A wind that had committed to its direction and its purpose and intended to continue indefinitely. She stood in it for 30 seconds. She looked at the sky. No stars, though it wasn't dawn yet, which meant cloud cover had moved in thick and total while she slept. She looked at the tree line to the north, where the lodge poles were moving in one unison, all of them leaning the same way, like an audience leaning towards something terrible. She went back inside. She woke the children and told them to stay in the chamber. She spent the next 2 hours carrying everything from the cabin that mattered. The remaining food stores, the medical tin, the extra lamp oil, Elias's tools, Owen's books, a second axe, and stowing it in the barn or lowering it down through the trap door. She worked without hurrying because hurrying is how you forget things. She moved fast without hurrying. There is a difference. By the time the snow started, she was done. It started as it often does, deceptively. A few flakes, loose and wandering, the kind that look like a light dusting, the kind that have lied to settlers for as long as there have been settlers to lie to. Agnes watched it from the barn doorway. Wait for 10 minutes. She watched how the flakes moved. They weren't falling, they were being driven. She closed the barn door. She descended. She pulled the trap door shut above her. The world outside ceased to exist in any immediate sense. There was the chamber, the lamp, the warm stone walls, the steady breathing of her children, the creak of horses shifting above. Everything else was muffled to abstraction. She added a small amount of wood to the firebox and let it catch. Then she sat on the edge of her bed, and she waited, and she listened. By midday, the sound had changed. The muffled quality of the world above had become something else. A pressure, a weight, a constant low conversation between wind and timber that the barn's old boards conducted down through the floor in faint vibration. The horses moved more frequently. Their hooves were a clock, and the clock had gotten nervous. Agnes kept the children calm the way she kept herself calm, through occupation. Owen did arithmetic. June sorted buttons into color groups, and then size groups, and then started again with a different system she invented and did not explain. Agnes mended a shirt she'd been putting off for a month, working the needle through thick cloth in the lamplight with even unhurried stitches. At some point in the afternoon, the light through the vent tiles changed. Not went dark exactly, but changed quality, graying down to something that suggested the sky outside had gone the color of iron. The wind sound increased. It was no longer a push. It was a press. By evening, snow was audible on the barn roof, not the soft sound of falling snow, but the hard, driven sound of snow arriving sideways, rattling against the boards, accumulating with intent. Agnes turned the lamp lower to conserve oil. The chamber temperature held at 50 degrees. She checked this by feel, the feel of her own hands, the feel of the air against her face when she turned toward the vent. 50 degrees is not warm in any comfortable sense. 50 degrees is the temperature of a spring morning when you'd want a coat. But 50 degrees is not 30 below zero. And that, right now, was the only comparison that mattered. The first night of the blizzard, all three of them slept. The second day, the storm did not relent. Agnes climbed to the barn floor at intervals to check the animals, to break ice from the water trough, to feel the temperature of the barn air. The barn itself, with its earth-banked north wall and its livestock and its stored hay, was holding somewhere in the mid-30s, cold enough to see your breath, warm enough to keep the animals safe. She worked efficiently, staying out of the wind entirely, and descended again. It was on the second afternoon that she heard faintly something she hadn't expected, a sound from the cabin direction, or what she thought was the cabin direction, muffled beyond recognition, filtered through earth and board and howling wind, but human. A voice. She stayed still and listened. Nothing more. She told herself it was the wind. Wind in the eaves of old buildings sounds like almost anything if you were listening for something. She checked the vent again. checked the firebox, checked June's forehead, cool and dry, nothing to worry about. She sat back down. The second night was colder. Agnes could tell not from the chamber itself, which held its temperature with the patient reliability she had built it to hold, but from the animals above. Their movements changed. They moved more, stood differently, clustered toward the center of the barn away from the walls. Animals respond to deep cold with their bodies before any thermometer catches up. The horses were telling her something she already knew and did not need to be afraid of. Outside, the temperature had dropped to a place that made previous nights seem mild. She kept the firebox fed with small amounts of wood, not large amounts, not enough to stress the ventilation, just enough to take the faint edge off the air and keep the flue clear. She thought about the Pruitt family, not because she knew they were in trouble. She didn't know that yet. She thought about them because she had noticed back in October that their stovepipe had a section that sat slightly off true, the kind of thing that's fine in moderate weather and becomes a problem in sustained extreme cold when metal contracts and old seams separate. She had thought about mentioning it to Clement Pruitt and had not, because Clement Pruitt was the kind of man who received observations from women the way he received weather reports from children, with visible patience and zero intention to act on them. She was thinking about this, about what she could have said and what would have happened if she had, when the sound came again. Closer this time, unmistakably human. She was up the ladder before she'd finished the thought, moving quietly so the children wouldn't wake, lifting the trap door just enough to let sound in. Wind, horse breath, the drum of snow against wood. And then, under all of it, a voice, young, high, somewhere between a call and a cry. She opened the trapdoor fully and climbed into the barn, crossed to the door, put her hand flat on it, and felt the vibration of the wind before she pushed. The door fought her. She put her shoulder into it, and it gave, and the storm came in like a living thing. Snow horizontal, temperature that hit exposed skin like ground glass. The wind a sound so complete it replaced all other sound entirely. A shape in the white, 12, maybe 13 years old. Moving wrong, arms wrapped around himself, no clear direction. The Pruitt boy, she knew him by his height and his father's coat, which was too large on him, even in ordinary weather, and looked enormous now, heavy with snow and ice. She stepped into the storm. She did not call out. The wind would have taken it. She moved toward the boy and reached him in 8 steps and put both hands on his shoulders, and he startled so hard he nearly fell. She steadied him. She turned him toward the barn. She didn't let go. Inside, she pushed the door shut, and the silence crashed back with the particular force that silence has when it follows total noise. The boy, his name was Thomas Pruitt, and he was 12, and his hands inside the oversized coat sleeves were white to the second knuckle, stood shaking so hard she could hear his breath stuttering. He looked at her with the focused, specific look of a child who has been frightened beyond the point of pretending otherwise. "The stove," he said. "It cracked last night. Smoke filled the house. Pa got us out, but we can't go back in." "Where are they now?" "The small shed. Pa's burning fence rails. Ma has the little ones, but it's—" He stopped. He didn't have the words for what it was. He didn't need them. Agnes understood was fun. "Wait here," she said. She crossed the barn, checked the trap door, still shut, children still below, and pulled on her second coat, the heavier one she kept on a peg near the north wall. She wrapped her face. She checked her hands. Then she stepped back out into it. She found the Pruitt family in the shed in the state she had expected. Clement Pruitt feeding thin rails into a small iron box that was not built for sustained heat, his wife Margaret holding the youngest child, 2 others pressed against her, everyone wearing everything they owned and still not warm enough. The shed smelled of desperation, which has a specific smell, wood smoke and damp wool, and the sharp edge of fear sweat in cold air. Clement looked at her. There was something in his expression she recognized. Not relief exactly, not yet. Something more complicated. The look of a man who has been managing a situation alone and knows in the moment someone arrives that he has been managing it badly. "Can you walk?" Agnes asked Margaret. "Yes." "Bring the children. Bring whatever blankets you have." She led them across the yard in a line, one hand on Thomas at the front, Margaret at the back knowing to keep moving, the wind screaming the whole way, and the snow finding every gap in every piece of clothing any of them were wearing. 30 yards. It took longer than it should have and less time than it felt like. She got them inside the barn. She was reaching for the trap door when she heard it, not from outside, but from the direction of the barn door, a slow, repetitive sound against the boards. A knocking but weak, the knock of someone who didn't have much left in their arms. She crossed to the door and pulled it open. Herschel Vane. He was standing, barely. Both hands pressed flat against the barn wall for balance, his body leaning into the wood in a way that wasn't quite standing and wasn't quite falling. His face was wrapped in a wool scarf that had iced over at the mouth. His hands, below his coat cuffs, were the color of old candle wax. He looked at her. She had known Herschel Vane for 7 years. He had been at her husband's burial. He had nodded at her in church every Sunday since and looked away too quickly. He had said, within earshot of Agnes not once but twice, that she should consider whether she was really suited to running a homestead alone. He had told his wife, who had told several others, that Agnes had gone strange, and the word had traveled back to Agnes the way words always travel in a valley with 500 people in it. Slowly, then all at once. She looked at him now. He was not a man making a judgment. He was a man who had made it 20 yards from his own property in a storm that was killing the valley and run out of forward motion. Agnes said, "Come." One word, not warm, not cold, practical. The word of someone who has assessed a situation and determined the only sensible response. Herschel Vane stepped inside. She helped him to the barn wall and left him there a moment while she got the trap door open. Warm air rose immediately, not dramatically, not like a blast from a furnace, but with that steady, patient quality that heat has when it comes from the earth rather than from flame. The kind of warmth you feel first in your hands and then in your chest and then throughout, like a tide coming in. The Pruitt children reached the ladder first. Agnes guided them down one at a time. Margaret followed, Clement after her. Thomas, composed now with the composure that arrives in children after fear passes and purpose replaces it, helped his mother find the rungs. Agnes turned to Herschel Vane. He was staring at the open trap door, at the warm light rising from below, at the ladder descending into the earth. She watched his face work through something. Not just surprise, but a more complicated reckoning. The reckoning of a man confronting the distance between what he assumed and what was actually true. "Go down," she said. He went. When his boots touched the chamber floor, and he straightened and felt the temperature of the air, really felt, what 50 degrees meant when the world above was 30 below, he made a sound. Not a word. A low sound, involuntary, the sound of a body registering something the mind is still catching up to. 9 people in a chamber built for 3. Agnes came down last and pulled the trap door shut above her. The storm became a rumor, a distant conversation, something happening in another world. She looked at the 9 faces in the lamplight. Owen, awake now, had pressed himself into the corner of his pallet to make room and was watching everything with his father's careful eyes. June was sitting up, holding her blanket around her shoulders, taking in the situation with the particular alertness of a 5-year-old for whom the night has suddenly become significantly more interesting. Agnes set down the extra lamp she'd brought from the barn wall and lit it from the first. More light. The chamber expanded slightly in it, or seemed to. She organized them the way she organized everything, practically without sentiment, with a clear understanding of priorities. The Pruitt children against the south wall with the most blankets. Margaret Pruitt with the youngest in her arms given the rope bed. Clement and Thomas on the remaining floor space with their own blankets supplemented. Herschel Vane in the northeast corner where the firebox threw the most warmth. She assigned tasks. Owen would watch the vent tile and tell her if the thread she'd tied to it stopped moving. Thomas Pruitt, 12 years old and steady now, would be responsible for the firebox, keeping it fed with small amounts of wood only, no larger pieces. She showed him the size with her hands. Clement Pruitt would check the animals at intervals, using the internal ladder, not going outside. She gave orders to a room full of adults and children, and they took them because Agnes Harlow in that moment was not a woman who people declined to take orders from. The storm continued. Day 3. The snow stopped being weather and became geography. It was remaking the valley. filling in the low places, rounding off everything that had been angular. Drifts climbed past windowsills. The road to town had ceased to exist as a distinction between one piece of ground and another. In the chamber, the temperature held. Agnes checked it constantly, not with any instrument, but with her hands, her face, the quality of her breath. 50 degrees, sometimes 48, never lower. The firebox ran small and steady. Above them, the animals breathed in their slow, bovine way, indifferent to history. It was on the third night that June began to feel warm. Not warm the right way. Agnes noticed it in the quality of the child's sleep, restless, turning, small sounds that weren't quite words. She pressed her hand to June's forehead and felt the specific, unmistakable warmth of a child's fever. Not the warmth of a well-covered child in a warm room, but the interior warmth of a body doing battle with something. Not high, not yet, but there. Agnes sat beside her daughter on the pallet and did not move. She had one tin of medical supplies, willow bark for fever, a small bottle of camphor, cloth for compresses. She had brought it down on the first day, which she now understood had not been coincidence, had been the same part of her mind that always prepared for the things she hoped wouldn't happen. She wet a cloth in the water pail, wrung it nearly dry, and laid it across June's forehead. June opened her eyes. "Mama, I'm here. Is the cow still up there?" "Yes." "Is she warm?" "She's very warm." June closed her eyes again. Agnes sat in the low lamplight with the sound of the storm moving distantly above and 8 other people breathing the air she had built this space to hold. And she looked at her daughter's face, and for the first time since October, she felt the particular vertigo of a person whose plan meets something the plan did not include. She thought about what she had and what she needed. She thought about the next 6 hours. She thought about the willow bark and the water temperature, and the difference between a fever that breaks by morning and one that doesn't. And in the darkness, very quietly, in a voice too low for anyone to hear, she said, "Hold, Elias, just hold." She did not know if she was talking to the chamber or the earth around it, or some version of her husband that lived in the part of her that hadn't yet accepted he was gone. It didn't matter. She said it because she needed to say something to something, and that was what came out. Then she folded the compress in half, laid it back on June's forehead, and went back to watching. By morning, the fever had not risen. By the following afternoon, it had broken. Agnes changed the compress, checked the vent, told Thomas to add one small piece of wood to the firebox, watched Owen watch the thread, listened to the storm. On the 4th day, Cormac Dell arrived. She heard him before she saw him. A knock on the barn door, different from the wind, deliberate and human. She climbed up, crossed the barn floor, opened the door. Dell stood in the opening, ice-covered from hat to boot, blinking against the barn's relative warmth. He was a compact man, not given to expression, which is why Agnes had always found him easier to deal with than most. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at a ledger, taking it in completely before forming an opinion. "You haven't come for supplies," he said. "No. 4 families at the post are running through their wood. I needed to understand why you hadn't." This was, Agnes knew, as close as Cormac Dell was going to come to admitting he'd walk through a blizzard because he was worried about her. She let it stand as what it was. She stood back from the door. He came in. She walked to the trap door and opened it, and the warmth came up, and Cormac Dell looked at it for a long moment. At the ladder, at the light below, at the faces visible from this angle, 8 faces in a lamplit space underground, alive and intact. He said nothing for almost 30 seconds. Then, "How many more can it hold?" Agnes said, "It's not about space. It's about air." Dell looked at her. "Then tell me about the air." She told him. Standing in the barn with the trap door open and the warmth rising between them, she explained the ventilation, the tile diameter, the angle of rise, the ratio of interior volume to vent cross-section, the reason the firebox was small and why it needed to stay small. She used no technical language because she had no technical language. She used observation and result. She said, "This is what I built, and this is what it does, and this is why." Cormac Dell listened the way a man listens when he's trying to learn something rather than form an opinion. When she finished, he nodded once. I've got a storage shed at the post, next to the horse stable. Same setup as possible. Not exactly the same, Agnes said. You'd need to dig faster and you wouldn't have time to stone the walls properly. But the principle holds. Get below the frost line. Use the stable heat. Keep the vent clear. Can you draw it? She looked at him. I didn't draw anything, I just dug. He considered this. Can you describe it again? Slowly. She described it again. The fifth day the wind stopped. Not the storm, the wind. The snow continued, heavier than before, falling straight down now in the windless air, the thick, wet snow that comes when a storm has fully committed. The thermometer at Dell's post, which he reached that morning through drifts to his waist, read -34. He looked at it and went back inside. In the chamber, June was drawing on the wall again. Agnes watched her daughter add a new figure to the east wall gallery. A small person, underground, surrounded by stone, with what appeared to be a cow floating above her head. Agnes looked at it for a long moment. Is that us? She asked. June considered the drawing with the critical eye of an artist evaluating her own work. That's me, she said, pointing to the small figure. She pointed to the cow. That's the cow. And she pointed to the stone. That's the worm. Agnes looked at the drawing. Yes, she said, that's exactly what it is. Outside, the snow fell straight and heavy, and the valley disappeared further beneath it, and the thermometer at the trading post held its terrible number. And beneath one ordinary barn, in a space carved from the earth by a woman with a shovel, and a problem she refused to lose to, 9 people breathed the same air and stayed warm and waited for winter to remember that it always eventually ended. The 7th day, that was when the storm finally made its decision, not to end, not yet, but to change. The snow slowed from its dense, suffocating fall to something lighter, intermittent, the kind of snow that falls between thoughts rather than in the middle of them. The wind stayed gone. The sky above the valley remained the color of old iron, but there was a quality to the light that hadn't been there before, a faint, grudging suggestion that somewhere above the cloud cover, the sun still existed and still had opinions about the matter. Agnes noticed it through the vent tile. Not light exactly, a change in the darkness, a shade of gray where there had been only black. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quality of the silence above, and understood that the worst of it had passed. She climbed the ladder. The barn was cold in the way a barn is cold after a week of sustained extreme temperature. Not dangerously cold, but settled into its cold the way furniture settles into a room, as if it had always been this way and intended to continue. The horses stood quiet, heads low, conserving. The cow blinked at Agnes with her slow, patient eyes. Agnes broke the ice from the trough, filled it, forked hay down from the loft. Then she pushed open the barn door. The valley was unrecognizable, not because it was destroyed, it wasn't, not visibly, but because it had been remade. Every angle was gone. Every fence line, every rut, every familiar low place and high place had been smoothed into a single continuous white surface that rose and fell in shapes that had nothing to do with what lay beneath them. The cabin was visible only as a particular kind of mound, a rectangular interruption in the white with a dark slot where the door was and a cold chimney rising from one end. The road to town did not exist. Agnes stood in the doorway for a long moment, breathing air that was still brutally cold but no longer moving, and she looked at the valley she had lived in for 11 years and could not find a single landmark she recognized by its shape. She went back inside. She told the adults what she'd found. She told them in the same tone she used for everything, direct without theater, as if she were describing the contents of a supply list. The storm had passed its worst. Travel was still impossible but would become possible within a day, perhaps 2. The chamber was intact. The animals were intact. Everyone was going to be fine. Clement Pruitt let out a breath that seemed to have been held for 3 days. Margaret pressed her youngest child's face against her shoulder and closed her eyes. Herschel Vane sat in his corner with his hands around a tin cup of warm water and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for most of the past 4 days, but it was a different kind of nothing now than it had been when he'd arrived. The nothing of a man processing something rather than the nothing of a man in shock. Agnes gave them an hour to absorb the news. Then she set them to work, because idle people in a recovered crisis tend to slide toward the kind of introspection that becomes complicated. And complicated was not something she had the infrastructure for right now. The children sorted and packed. The adults took turns going above to check the barn, to chip accumulated ice from the doors and hinges, to assess the state of the yard. Agnes herself spent 2 hours in the barn checking the ceiling beams above the chamber for any new compression. Any sound that suggested the weight of a week's accumulated snow had done something to the structure she hadn't accounted for. She found nothing. Every joint held, every brace sat where she'd put it. The ventilation tiles were clear. She'd kept them clear throughout, checking twice daily with a length of wire she'd bent for the purpose. The stone walls showed no new moisture, no new cracking, no sign of the cold having found a way in that it hadn't been offered. She stood in the chamber alone for a few minutes after the others had gone up. She looked at the walls, at the courses of stone fitted dry and careful, angled inward just slightly so gravity kept them honest. At the ceiling she'd built from salvaged timber and stubbornness. At the drainage basin in the corner, dry. The gravel doing its work, the sloped floor directing the nothing that had come toward it. At June's drawings on the east wall, 11 days of chalk figures recording the life that had happened here while the world above had tried to end. She thought about what it had cost. The blistered hands, the broken shovels, the mornings in October starting work before light so no one would come by and see what she was doing and tell her it was impossible or inadvisable or unbecoming. The weeks of hauling stone from the creek bed one armload at a time while the children napped. The 3 iterations of the ventilation design before she got the draw right. The evenings in November lying awake running through the structure in her mind, looking for the flaw she might have missed. She thought about Elias's wall of accidental earth against the north side of the barn, the wall that had started all of it. She thought about standing in the barn on that February night a year ago with Owen against her shoulder and her lungs full of cold and her mind, despite everything, registering, this is warmer than inside my house. Paying attention. That was all it had been. Paying attention and then being willing to do the work that the attention indicated. She picked up the lamp. She climbed the ladder. She had a valley to help dig out. The digging out took 3 days. Agnes organized it the way she organized the chamber, practically by priority without asking for consensus. Paths first, the gap between barn and cabin, the gap between her property and the Vane property to the west, the route toward the Prudett homestead so they could assess the damage to the house and stovepipe. Owen shoveled beside the adults with a determination that was entirely his own. Nobody had asked him to, and nobody told him to stop. Thomas Pruitt worked alongside him with the companionable silence of 2 boys who have been through something together and don't need to talk about it. The valley emerged slowly from its white covering, like a face becoming recognizable again. Fences materialized from the drifts in sections, some intact, some collapsed under the weight. The road to town reappeared as a suggestion, then a direction, then something a wagon could travel carefully. Cormac Dell had broken a path from the trading post with a team of horses the morning after the wind stopped, and that path connected to Agnes's yard by the afternoon of the second day. People moved through it like water-finding channels. They came to Dell's post for supplies and news and the particular comfort of being around other people through a sustained period of isolation and fear. They came with the gray, quiet expressions of those who had been frightened and were not yet ready to say so. They compared losses. Wood burned through, animals lost to cold, fences down, one chimney partially collapsed, 2 families who had burned furniture and were not ashamed of it because there was no shame available when the alternative was freezing. What they did not compare yet was the accounting of what had saved them and what had not. That accounting was coming. Agnes could feel it the way she felt weather changes, as a pressure, a texture in the air, something building toward articulation. It arrived on the 9th day after the storm broke, in the form of a man on horseback. Agnes saw him from the barn doorway, a rider coming along the track from town, moving with the particular deliberate pace of a man who has official business and wants to be seen arriving. He was young or youngish, a good coat, not a working coat, a leather satchel visible against the horse's flank. He rode with the posture of someone who had learned to ride rather than grown up doing it, which told Agnes something about where he'd come from and what he thought he was doing. He stopped at the yard gate and called out, "Agnes Harlow?" "Yes," she said. "Inspector Leland Marsh, from the county seat." He dismounted with the care of a man who'd ridden further than he was used to. "I've received a report regarding some modifications made to your barn structure. Unauthorized excavation, unapproved sleeping quarters." He produced papers from the satchel with the efficiency of a man who knows the weight that paper is supposed to carry. "I'm here to conduct an inspection and determine whether any remediation orders are necessary." Agnes looked at him. She looked at him the way she had looked at the cold in October, as a fact to be dealt with rather than a catastrophe to be feared. She had known, with the same practical certainty that had driven the construction of the chamber in the first place, that something like this would come. Dorothea Vane had been composing this letter in her head since November. The only question had been timing. "Come in," Agnes said. She opened the barn door. She let him in. She let him look at the barn first, at the animals, the hayloft, the general structure, and she watched him taking notes in a small leather notebook with a mechanical efficiency that she recognized as covering for the fact that he was not entirely sure what he was looking for. Then she crossed to the trap door and opened it. The warmth came up. Not dramatically, not like opening a furnace. The quiet, patient warmth of deep earth, which offers itself without insistence, which has no interest in impressing anyone, which simply is and has been, and will continue to be, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges it. Marsh stopped writing. He looked at the open trap door, at the ladder, at the light coming from below. He looked at Agnes. She said nothing. She simply gestured toward the ladder. He descended carefully, one rung at a time, his notebook still in one hand. Agnes followed him down. He stood at the bottom and turned, and she watched his face do what every face did when it encountered the chamber for the first time: the recalibration, the adjustment between what had been expected and what was actually present. He had come expecting something improvised and dangerous, something that would confirm the report's language. Unapproved, unauthorized, unsafe. What he found was stone walls fitted with the patience of someone who understood load and water and air. A ceiling braced beyond what minimum necessity required. A floor that drained. A ventilation system that worked. He could tell it worked because he could breathe easily, because the air had no staleness to it. None of the trapped quality that a sealed underground room develops within hours. He reached out and touched the wall. He pressed his palm flat against it and held it there. Agnes waited. He looked at the ceiling, at the joists and the additional beams she'd fitted perpendicular to them, at the way they interlocked, at the wedging and bracing that distributed the load of animals and snow across the whole structure rather than any single point. He crouched and looked at the drainage basin in the corner. He stood and looked at the firebox and ran his eye up the flue line to where it joined the ventilation path. He opened his notebook again. He wrote something. He closed it. Then he said, "Who built this?" Agnes said, "I did." A pause. "Where did you study?" Agnes looked at him steadily. "I didn't study anywhere. I paid attention." He absorbed this. He looked at the wall again, at the stones, at the way they sat. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the drawings on the east wall, June's chalk gallery, the horses and the house, and the small figure with the floating cow above her. He said more quietly, 9 people sheltered here." "Yes." "During the worst night of the storm, when the thermometer at the trading post read -42. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Agnes could hear the horses above them, that slow, rhythmic wait, that patient breathing that had been the engine of this whole enterprise from the beginning. Then he said something she didn't expect. "This shouldn't work." Not as a criticism, as a statement of honest surprise from a man who had some engineering education and was confronting the gap between what that education told him was possible and what was demonstrably, undeniably standing in front of him. Agnes said, "But it does." Marsh looked at her. "Yes," he said, "it does." He climbed up slowly. Agnes followed. He stood in the barn and made additional notes and then closed the notebook and returned it to his coat pocket. He looked at the barn around him, at the earth-banked north wall, at the relationship between the structure and the ground, at the way the building sat in the landscape. "I'm required to file a report," he said. "I know. There will be questions from the county office about the structural modifications, the procedure that wasn't followed." Agnes said, "I'll answer the questions." He nodded. He looked at the trap door, still open, warm air still rising from it in that steady, unhurried way. "Emergency shelter," he said, not quite to Agnes, in the tone of a man finding language in a regulation that fits an unusual situation. "Temporary structure constructed under emergency conditions. There's precedent for that." He said it quietly, as if thinking it through rather than announcing it. Agnes said nothing. "I'll need to note the dimensions," he said, "and the ventilation specifications. I'll give them to you." She gave them to him standing in the barn, speaking plainly, using the same language she'd used with Cormac Dell. Observation and result, cause and effect. This is what was built, and this is what it did. Marsh wrote everything down. He wrote more than she expected him to write. When she finished, he read back his notes and asked 2 clarifying questions and wrote the answers to those as well. When he left, he rode back toward town without looking back. Agnes stood in the barn doorway and watched him go. She did not feel relief exactly. She felt the particular quiet that follows a thing you were prepared for and moved through and finished with. The way a storm feels when it's over. Not celebratory, just done. The way work feels when it's complete. She closed the barn door. She went to check on the animals. March came in on the back of a last cold snap that announced itself with 3 days of hard frost and then relented. And the valley turned its face toward whatever warmth the sun could manage at this latitude in early spring. Ice split along the creek. Mud appeared under the snow along the south-facing slope above the tree line. The lodge poles to the north shook off their white and went back to being simply green against the sky. People began the accounting. They talked at Dell's trading post, over the counter and beside the stove, and in the yard while horses were hitched and unhitched. They talked in that careful frontier way that avoids direct statement and approaches important truths from angles. Who had come through clean? Who had lost animals? Who had burned what to stay warm and would need to replace it before next winter? And they talked about the chamber. Not all at once, not openly, not at first, but the way important information moves through a small community, from the people who had been in it to the people who knew them, and from those people outward. Each retelling adding a layer of understanding to the previous one, until the story had traveled far enough to lose the embarrassment of its origins and become simply the thing that had happened. 9 people, 7 days, minus 42, 50 degrees inside. The word odd, which had attached itself to Agnes Harlow in November and followed her through December, detached quietly sometime in February, and was replaced by something that didn't have a clean name, but felt like the opposite. Not famous, not celebrated. Frontier people were allergic to celebration of the living, reserving that energy for eulogies. Something more useful than celebration, something like known, trusted. The kind of reputation that comes not from being liked, but from being proven. Agnes noticed the change in the way she noticed most things, without attaching feeling to it, as information. Men slowed their horses when they passed her property. Not to stop, usually, just to slow in the way you slow past something you are thinking about. Dell stocked an extra supply of clay drainage tile that spring without explanation, and when a rancher named Aldous Pemberton came in asking about foundations and subsurface temperature and winter insulation, Dell said, "Talk to Agnes Harlow," and Pemberton did. Agnes talked to Pemberton on the porch of the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in late March. She was direct and complete, the same way she'd been with Dell and with Marsh. She described the drainage consideration, the ventilation ratio, the importance of not overfiring a small space, the value of stone over timber for the walls, the reason the entrance needed to be internal rather than external. Pemberton listened with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the middle distance, the way a man listens when he's constructing something in his head as the words come in. When she finished, he said, "That's a lot of work for one person." Agnes said, "Yes." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He said, "Worth it, though." "Yes," Agnes said, "worth it." It was in the first week of April that Herschel Vane came to her door. She had seen him twice since the storm, once across the yard at Dell's post, once passing on the road, and both times he had nodded at her with a particular gravity that was different from the nod he'd given her for the previous 7 years. The old nod had been the nod of a man completing a social obligation. This one was the nod of a man carrying something he hadn't yet found the words for. He came on a Wednesday, mid-morning, when the mud in the yard had dried enough to walk without losing a boot. He rode up to the fence and dismounted and tied his horse and came to the door. And when Agnes opened it, he was standing with his hat held in front of him in both hands, the brim turning slowly as his hands worked it around. He was not a man who apologized. Agnes had understood this about Herschel Vane from the first year she'd known him. He was the kind of man who had been taught, by his father in his father's world, that admitting a wrong was a form of weakness, and he had lived 60-some years inside that teaching until it had become architecture. Load-bearing, not easily removed. He said, "I'm digging out the floor of my north stall." Agnes looked at him. "For a winter room," he said. 12 by 10, I'm thinking. "The soil's different on my property. More clay than yours. Drain's different. Thought you might know whether that changes the wall construction." Agnes stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on the table beside him and his hands flat on the wood, and Agnes made coffee and sat across from him, and they talked for an hour and a half about drainage and clay soil and the angle at which stone needed to be placed when the earth behind it had more moisture content than pure dirt. She drew things on a piece of paper, not plans exactly, more like diagrams, arrows and angles in rough proportions. At no point did either of them mention the previous November, or the things Herschel had said, or the look on his face when Agnes had appeared at his door and said, "Come," and he had followed her into the earth and felt the warmth that she had built. They didn't need to. He was here. He was asking how to build it. That was the only apology that mattered, and Agnes Harlow had always been more interested in what people did than what they said. When he left, he folded the diagram and put it in his coat pocket. He put his hat back on at the door. He said, "I'll let you know how the clay settles." "Do that," Agnes said. He rode away down the track that was finally, slowly, becoming a road again. Agnes stood at the door for a moment looking at the property, at the barn, at the cabin, at the yard that was half mud and half the last gray patches of winter snow retreating into the shadowed places where the sun hadn't reached yet. She looked at all of it and thought about the previous October, about the first morning she'd lifted that plank and climbed down with a shovel and started removing earth from a place that had never had any reason to be anything other than ground. She hadn't told anyone what she was doing. She hadn't asked for permission or approval or a consensus opinion on the likelihood of success. She had thought about a problem, found an approach that made sense to her, and done the work. And then when winter came and the work was needed, it had been there. It had worked not because it was clever or visionary or bold. It had worked because it was sound, because she had thought it through from every angle until the angles ran out, and then she had built it, and it had done what sound things do when they're tested. It had held. The inspector's report arrived by post in the second week of April. Dell brought it out on his supply run, as he sometimes brought mail for the outlying properties. He set it on the counter without comment, a sealed envelope, official, with the county stamp pressed into the wax. Agnes opened it that evening at the table, with Owen's lamp providing the light, June already asleep. It was 3 pages, dense with the particular language of official documents, passive voice, passive judgment, the careful institutional habit of stating conclusions without attaching a human hand to them. She read it twice. The report described the structure in detail: dimensions, materials, construction method, ventilation design. It described the circumstances under which it had been used: extreme weather event, temperatures reaching -42 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 individuals sheltered for a period of 7 days. It noted that no injuries had occurred attributable to the structure's use, that the structural integrity had not been compromised during the event, and that the ventilation system had functioned within parameters consistent with safe habitation. The final paragraph contained the language Marsh had been working out in the barn that day: emergency shelter constructed and used under exigent conditions. Structure demonstrates functional integrity. No remediation order indicated at this time. Subject to standard review upon any planned modification or expansion. No order to dismantle. No fine. The matter officially was closed. Agnes folded the report and put it in the tin box she kept on the shelf above the fireplace, the box that held the homestead claim and the deed to the property and the handful of other documents that constituted the legal evidence of her existence in Willow Creek Valley. She sat at the table for a while longer, not doing anything. Owen had gone to bed. The fire had settled into its quiet evening conversation. Outside the window, the valley was dark and still in the way April evenings are. Not winter still anymore, but not yet the busy, complicated dark of summer. Something in between. She thought about Elias's wall, about the accidental pile of earth against the north side of a barn that had stood for 3 years, doing nothing except, without knowing it, holding a temperature. She thought about standing in the barn at 4 in the morning with Owen sick against her shoulder and understanding in the plain language of her own body that the ground held something the air gave up. She thought about the things you notice when you stop expecting other people to notice them for you. Summer came to Willow Creek Valley with the particular earnestness of a Montana summer, short and certain of itself, full of long light and quick warmth, and the sense of land that knows it has a limited time to accomplish something. The valley repaired itself with the same quiet practicality its people had. Fences went back up, roofs were patched, chimneys were rebuilt properly, the Pruitt chimney among them. And in 3 separate places in the valley, men dug, not dramatically, not with announcement. They dug in the mornings before the day got busy, lifting planks from barn floors and going down with shovels. And the soil came up in buckets and the space grew. Herschel Vane, Aldous Pemberton. A third man, Silas Drury, who ran cattle on the east side of the valley and said nothing to anyone about his project until it was done, and then mentioned it casually to Dell as if it had always existed. Dell put a note in his supply ledger that summer. Under a heading he'd invented himself, winter structures, subsurface. He wrote a set of specifications, dimensions, drainage, ventilation, ratios, firebox sizing. He'd assembled them from his conversation with Agnes, from watching Vane's construction, from asking Pemberton a few questions. He didn't present them as instructions. He presented them as information, the way he presented all information, available to whoever needed it, without editorial. The following winter was moderate, not mild. Nothing in Montana was mild, but manageable in the ordinary ways. Families burned their wood and kept their fires and moved through January and February with the wary efficiency that had always characterized winter survival in the valley. Nobody needed to go underground. The winter rooms were there anyway. Agnes checked hers in October, the same way she checked it every October. The walls, the beams, the drainage basin, the ventilation draw. She found nothing that needed attention. She restocked the oil lamp, replaced a section of the flue pipe that had developed a small crack, tightened 2 of the ceiling brace wedges that had dried and settled slightly over the summer. She didn't move the family down that year. The cabin was improved. She'd had a carpenter from town rebuild the chinking in August, and the floor now sat on a raised platform with a proper air gap beneath it, and the difference in warmth was immediate and significant. She and Owen had reset the fireplace hearth with better stone that didn't crack in the cold. The cabin could handle this winter, but she didn't fill into the chamber. She didn't reduce the ladder or seal the trapdoor or spread the soil back. Owen asked her about it one November evening, not the first time he'd asked, but the first time he'd asked it in the voice of a boy old enough to understand that the answer might be complicated. "We're not using it this year," he said. "Are we going to keep it?" Agnes was mending at the table, the lamp between them. She kept her eyes on the work for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "Why?" She set the mending down. She looked at her son, who had her eyes and his father's jaw and who had spent 7 days underground at the age of 8 and emerged with the calm practicality of someone who had learned early that the world was manageable if you paid attention to it. "Because winter comes back," she said. "It always comes back. And the next time it does, or the time after that, or the time after that, the chamber will be there." She picked up the mending again. "You don't fill in a well because you had rain." Owen considered this with the seriousness he brought to most things. "What if nobody needs it?" he said. "Then nobody needs it," Agnes said, "and it's still there. Either way, the work wasn't wasted." Owen went back to his reader. The fire talked to itself in the hearth. Outside, the first light snow of that season's winter drifted down past the window. Quiet, uncommitted. The snow of a winter that hadn't decided yet how serious it intended to be. Agnes watched it for a moment through the glass. Then she went back to the mending. 5 years later, in the winter of 1891, the chamber was still there. June was 11 years old by then and possessed of the particular confidence that comes to children who grow up knowing something that other children don't. She knew in a way that had become so fundamental, she no longer thought of it as knowledge, just as fact, the same way she knew how to read or how to find north, that the earth held warmth and that warmth could be kept if you knew how to ask for it. She had 3 friends from town who sometimes came out on Saturdays to help with chores and stay for the midday meal. And one November Saturday, she brought them to the barn and opened the trap door with the casual authority of someone showing a familiar room, and she climbed down first and held the lamp up for them to see. They came down one at a time, their eyes going wide in the way eyes go wide when the world contradicts their expectations. They pressed their palms against the stone walls. They looked up at the ceiling, at the timber bracing, at the careful joints. They felt the temperature of the air, which was different from the air outside in a way that was almost impossible to describe to someone who hadn't felt it. Not dramatically warmer, but steady in a way that indoor air in a building never quite is, with the deep, patient quality of something that has been here longer than any structure above it. One of the girls asked, "Who built this?" June held up the lamp. She looked around the chamber. At the walls, her mother had fitted, stone by stone, over 3 weeks in October 1885. At the ceiling beams cut to length and wedged into place by a woman with no engineering training and 2 broken shovels and a problem she refused to be defeated by. At the chalk drawings, still faintly visible on the east wall, horses and figures and one small person with a floating cow above her head. "My mother," June said. "How did she know how to do it?" June looked at the walls for a moment. "She paid attention," she said, "and then she did the work. She turned down the lamp slightly, the way her mother had taught her, the way her mother had taught her everything. Not with long explanations, not with sentiment, but with the plain, direct transmission of something that had been earned and was worth keeping. Above them, the animals shifted in their slow winter way. The earth held its temperature. The valley outside was cold and still and white, the same as it had always been, the same as it would be again next year and the year after, patient and absolute and indifferent to the small, warm lives moving through it. But beneath one ordinary barn, in the dark below the frost line, the warmth that a woman had built from attention and stone and stubbornness held steady against everything winter could offer. It had held for 6 years. It would hold for many more. Not because anyone famous had built it, not because anyone had approved it or celebrated it or written about it in the newspapers that reached Willow Creek Valley 6 days after they were printed. Because it was sound. Because the work had been done carefully, by someone who understood that the difference between surviving and not surviving is often not luck or talent or resources, but simply this: paying attention to what the world is already doing and being willing to do the work that the attention requires. Agnes Harlow had paid attention. She had done the work. The earth remembered.